My name is Michael Grauer. I'm the moderator for this session on Texas Impressionism. In my 31 years at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, I did a couple of Texas art exhibitions while I was there. So if you'll bear with me, I don't really like to talk about my work very much, but I have to mention a couple of them today. But I was asked to moderate this panel, and so hopefully you'll have robust questions at the end. But first, I thought it might be helpful to give a sort of a summary of exhibitions in Texas in the last decade that primarily focused on the Impressionist movement in this state, and then turn it over to our speaker here in just a second. The Dallas Museum of Art's 2008 exhibition, Bluebonnets and Beyond, Julian Onderdonk, American Impressionist, curated by William Rudolph with its accompanying catalog, broke new ground in scholarship on early Texas early Texas art exhibitions. Traveling to the Whitty Museum and the Stark Museum of Art in Orange, Texas, the exhibition sought to redress the balance between Onderdonk's technique and its dialogue with 19th and 20th century American art, and to challenge traditional classifications of regionalist and mainstream art. Inspired by this redressing, the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum organized the 113 painting exhibition Texas Impressionism, Branding with Brushstrokes and Color, 1885 to 1935. Which toured the state from April 2012 to early January 2014. A 166-page soft-cover catalog published by the museum with essays by William H. Gertz, arguably the foremost authority on American regionalism, and I mean regionalism geographically, and American Impressionism, and by myself, accompanied the exhibition. The show opened at Panhandle Plains and was then seen at the Grace Museum in Abilene, the Tyler Museum of Art, the Whitty Museum here in San Antonio, and the Art Museum of Southeast Texas in Beaumont. All venues reported excellent attendance for the exhibition and glowing reviews. A docent at the Art Museum of Southeast Texas remarked it was the best attended exhibition which she could remember. And those of us who are curators know if you hang Impressionism over the door, people will start lining up, and especially if you write Monet somewhere on it, you're sold. For purposes of this exhibition, Panhandle Plains chose to adhere fairly rigidly to a few Impressionist requirements put out by Dr. Gertz for a painting to be included, namely painted between 1885 and 1935, a high-keyed palette bordering on and including the pastel colors, active brushwork with short strokes applied quickly over the surface, and usually painted en plein air. Ironically, the life of the best-known Texas Impressionist, Julian Onderdonk, almost perfectly bracketed the rise, practice, and decline of Impressionist painting in the United States. Dr. Gertz observed that by 1920, quote, Impressionism, once a vital modern force in American painting, had become both conventionalized and conservative in the light of newer developments in American art, end quote. Three main figures in early Texas art, Emma Richardson Cherry, Robert Onderdonk, and Frank Ray, had become established artists in Texas and had been exposed to French Impressionism and its offshoots in other parts of the globe by 1900. They either painted Impressionist pictures themselves and or encouraged its tenets in Texas. Other important early Texas artists emerged as key to Texas Impressionism. Julian Onderdonk's studies in New York provided him Impressionist tools to paint the South Texas landscape, as we saw with William Randolph's exhibition. Onderdonk's landscapes certainly inspired the San Antonio competitive exhibitions, the so-called Davis competitions, of paintings of Texas wildflowers in San Antonio from 1927 to 1929, and ultimately gave rise to the ubiquitous Bluebonnet School, prevalent in Texas even today. Prominent among the entrants in the San Antonio competitives were Impressionists such as Dawson Watts, Jose Arpa, Edward G. Eisenlohr, and Ella Kepke-Mewini. Tex patriots, as I call them, such as Seymour Thomas, Murray Bewley, and Lucian Abrams, lived in France but sent their French paintings to Texas art exhibitions anyway. Perhaps the only Texas artist to be clearly identified with American Impressionism during its heyday in the United States was Lucian Abrams. One of the many results and deductions gleaned from Texas Impressionism, the exhibition, was the need for additional exhibitions and scholarly studies related to the topic. For example, I was allowed to guest curate with the Old Jail Art Center in Albany an exhibition on Lucian Abrams called Lucian Abrams and Impressionists from Texas in the spring of 2013. This exhibition was also showed at Panhandle Plains and in a slightly different form as Lucian Abrams, a cosmopolitan in Connecticut, because of course he had a home in Connecticut and one here in San Antonio, as well as in Dallas. At the Florence Griswold Museum at Old Lyme, Connecticut in 2014, and the Griswold is arguably sort of the center for American Impressionism for many reasons. While not specifically targeting the Impressionist qualities of his work, Amy Fulkerson here at the Whitty Museum organized Porfirio Salinas Capturing South Texas in the fall of 2013. In April 2015, Kate Sheeran guest curated for the San Antonio Museum of Art The Three Worlds of Jose Arpa y Perea, Spain, Mexico, and San Antonio, a focused exhibition of over 20 works. Kaylin H. Weber, Associate Curator of American Art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, organized Julian Onderdonk and the Texan Landscape in October 2016, which was also seen at the San Antonio Museum of Art from January to April 2017. Finally, I curated Jose Arpa, a Spanish painter in Texas, which opened at Panhandle Plains in April 2016, then traveled to San Angelo Museum of Fine Arts and the Art Museum of Southeast Texas at Beaumont, and concluded the tour here at the Whitty, appropriately in my view, in August 2017. I would argue that Jose Arpa had as much impact on Impressionist painting in Texas as any other artist. Post-Impressionism also had a significant impact on Texas art, an area we really haven't studied yet. Consequently, an exhibition tentatively called Lone Star Fauves, Post-Impressionism in Texas, is in the works. The exhibition, Texas Impressionism, Branding with Brushstrokes and Color, attempted to break the stereotypes about what constitutes a Texas painting by showing that an important contribution to American Impressionism was practiced by Texas artists, whether those paintings they produced depicted Texas or not. Moreover, we hope the exhibition would impact the study of early Texas artists significantly, as the Dallas Museum of Art's seminal 1985 exhibition, Lone Star Regionalism, the Dallas Nine in Their Circle. Our speaker today is the Chief Curator and the Marie and Hugh Half Curator of American and European Art at the San Antonio Museum of Art. He earned his PhD from Bryn Mawr. He previously served as curator at the Dallas Museum of Art, the Worcester Art Museum, and the Milwaukee Art Museum. His exhibitions as organizing curator and or co-curator include Spain, 500 Years of Spanish Painting from the Museums of Madrid, Nelson Rockefeller's Picassos, tapestries commissioned by, I can't pronounce that word, Thomas Sully Painted Performance, In Search of Julian Hudson, Free Artist of Color in Pre-Civil War New Orleans, Bluebonnets and Beyond, Julian Onderdonk, American Impressionists, as we've heard before, and Charles Sheeler's Power Series. Please welcome William Rudolph.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael, for that introduction. And I just want to say at the outset, oh, there we go. Do I have a clicker? Is this my clicker? Where is the clicker? Sorry. This is the clicker? Where are the millennials? Is what I always ask now, because I am getting older and I no longer can fix paper jams and copiers or apparently figure out my clickers, so bear with me. One of the things that I hope is made clear from Michael's very great introduction is several things. One is that there's been an incredible amount of work on Texas art in the last decade, and it really builds upon some foundational work that has been done. Those of us who just heard Becky Duval-Reese speak also know some of additional foundations. And I, in this talk, which is spurred actually really by an exhibition that we are putting together at San Antonio Museum of Art, really stand on the shoulders of giants here. And a lot of what I am talking about today, dealing with Texas and its Impressionists, really is indebted to and is thinking through work that Michael has done in the projects that he mentioned, particularly the Texas Impressionists and Jose Arpa, also the work that Kate Sheeran has done for us at SAMA, the work that Emily Neff and Kaylin Weber have done, that Harry Half has done in putting together that monumental catalog raisonné of Julian Onderdonk's work, and my own work on Julian, which of course changes as everything changes. You live with artists for a while, and then you don't think about them every day for a while, and then as you see more and learn more, you also change your mind about certain things as well. So these are kind of notes towards a history. This is not a definitive history of Impressionism in Texas. It sort of synthesizes some things that many of these colleagues who I've mentioned have helped me to think about, And it is in the service of several things. One is the extraordinary exhibition that some of you have already seen today, and that I will get to see a little bit later, that Michael and Ron have put together. And I send them, bouquets of flowers in advance, because to actually do a story like that is rather extraordinary and wonderful, and says a lot about where we are in 2019 in our study and appreciation of Texas art. The other thing is to think about this in the context of a project that we are putting together at San Antonio Museum of Art beginning in summer 2020, which is a show called America's Impressionism, because you have to have a colon. Just like you have to have a colon in real life, you have to have a colon in an exhibition title. Echoes of a Revolution, and that is a project that has been initiated by the Brandywine River Museum, one of the great American regional institutions in this country, located between Philadelphia and Wilmington, Delaware. And we have signed on to that along with the Dixon Gallery and Gardens in Memphis, Tennessee, whose terrific director and chief curator, Kevin Sharp, has done a number of foundational projects dealing with Impressionism. And so Amanda Burden, the really smart curator there, Kevin Sharp, and myself are really thinking about a national story of Impressionism, which, like everything else, is of course indebted to Bill Gertz, who Michael's words about regionalism and Dr. Gertz, I mean, if it weren't for the work that Bill Gertz has done, none of us would have anything to say. Particularly, the Bible, the 3-volume Bible, Art Across America from 1990, weighs down many of our bookshelves, and it does not gather dust. We keep going back to it again and again and again. So we are thinking about how Impressionism started as a then radical movement in France, moved across the Atlantic, and then across the country. And I, in particular, have been thinking about, for my part of the checklist, how it moved into Texas. So today's talk thinks through some of these things. Okay, let's pretend I'm a millennial. I'm still mildly surprised when things like this happen. Okay, so the story that I'm going to sort of sketch out a little bit, and again, this is a rudimentary sketch, like the beginning of an Impressionist painting, is really based upon, there are 3 strands that I want to talk about today of that more or less 40-year period that Michael mentioned at the beginning, the sort of 1896 to 1936, 1894 to 1934, it's just under half a century, but quite an important half century. And in that half century, several things really were required to foster Impressionism in this state. One was some extraordinarily influential and groundbreaking exhibitions that happened in the state that either featured Impressionist works from outside or Impressionist works made in the state, and both at the same time, of course. Then also, which we'll talk about briefly, and then also there are the careers of incredibly influential practitioners, some of which this will echo Becky's talk. It will echo every talk you've probably heard yet today, and echo your experience, the wonderful talk that Michael and Ron gave us at lunch, and then also the experience of being in the show, because there's a reason why these names keep coming up. Now, there are some names whom I won't be speaking about who should, in a longer talk, be spoken about, but one does have to pick and choose. So I sort of selectively put it down to who we're featuring in our show in San Antonio next summer. And then finally, there is, as Michael mentioned in his introduction, a very unique ingredient at the end of the story, as it were, the sort of other bookend, which are the San Antonio competitive exhibitions, which are popularly, for better or for worse, known as the Davis Prize, that sort of put the icing on the cake. And these 3 things, from our perspective, nearly 100 years later, seem to coalesce and create what we call Impressionism in Texas, or Texas Impressionism. I think it's a whole other talk which way you want to call it and what the choices of those words mean. And this is one thing that we're going to try to tease out a little bit in our exhibition, as well as surrounding Texas art, which should be, I hope, fairly visually exciting, with work made in California and work made elsewhere, to really talk about the robust nature of American art in the first part of the 20th century. Let me go back for a second. And that worked too. Okay, this may happen, all right? We may have liftoff. So let's talk about some extraordinarily important exhibitions, the first ingredient. And one of them is this. You're seeing the cover of and an article about the Texas Coastal Fair from November 10th through 14th, 1896, organized by Emma Richardson Cherry, who wrote the article, as you can see, that appears on the right. And I thank both Michael and Randy Tibbetts for bringing this to public attention about the incredible role that Emma Richardson Cherry played in this. This is the first exhibition to specifically feature and deliberately feature Impressionist works in Texas. Now, anyone who has ever organized an exhibition should be both thrilled and horrified to think about the fact that there were 254 works of art on this checklist for a show that was only on view for 5 days. It kind of makes me want to just go curl up in a ball and die, because registrars, I can't believe, there were no registrars apparently for this show, otherwise they would have said no. But it was an incredibly influential project, and within that exhibition, which is the exposure of a broad audience in this state to this new type of painting, they saw this work on the gallery at the Pines by Emma Richardson Cherry, an extraordinarily wonderful picture of her mother and one of her children on the porch of the family home. And the experiments in spatial cropping here, the interest in light and shadow on the figures, that moment of intensity and that attention to atmosphere are all, of course, characteristics of Impressionism by this time, and must have been rather revelatory for an audience to see in 1896. And we are very, very happy to say that this picture will be featured in San Antonio next summer at the San Antonio Museum of Art as part of the exhibition. I can't even, Emma Richardson Cherry is somebody I learn more about all the time, and she is someone who we'll talk about a little bit later, and you can't overestimate Emma Richardson Cherry's importance to art in Texas. Another series of an ongoing series of extraordinarily influential exhibitions, which I privileged in my work on Julian Onderdonk. They are not the only part of the story. I think I possibly exaggerated their importance a little bit 10 years ago because I was living in Dallas. And Dallas, I love you, bless you, but you know, we always do think that we invented the wheel, and you know, there are other wheels that roll along as well. So now I live in San Antonio, so you know, this wasn't the only exhibition that happened in the first part of the 20th century, but it was important. And that, of course, is the art exhibition at the State Fair of Texas. I show you a representative cover from 1908 from the art exhibition, and then I show you a painting bought out of that sale by the Dallas Art Association, the parent organization of what later became the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, then later to be renamed the Dallas Museum of Art. And it is a terrific work by Colin Campbell Cooper of the Flatiron Building, which Cooper will be on our checklist, not this particular work, but he is someone who practiced a particular brand of urban American Impressionism, both on the East and actually on the West Coast. And he's someone that we're really thrilled our colleagues at the Brandywine have really started to pay new attention to and will be featuring in the project. So this is Impressionist art being bought as contemporary art by a fledgling museum in Texas out of a show. And I should also mention that two of the curators involved with the long history of the art department at the State Fair were first Robert Jenkins Onderdonk, and then concurrently, and then after Robert's death, his son Julian Onderdonk. So both artists and tastemakers as well, just like Emma Richardson Cherry had been. So as the last sort of part of the exhibition piece of the puzzle, a show that we've heard about multiple times already today because it was actually rather important. The Centennial Exhibition in 1936 in Fair Park in Dallas. You see the cover on the right, and then you see a work that was featured in that exhibition, which we are fortunate enough to have on loan to us right now at San Antonio Museum of Art, where you can see it in our third floor East Tower, Texas gallery. Sorry, have to give my own institution props because it is just down the street and we're open till 9 p.m. tonight. You can see the terrific show here, and then you can go down the street and see more Texas art if you would like. I'll be feeding dogs and doing other stuff, but I will know you're there because I'll have spies set up to catch you. But the point is that as Becky mentioned, as Michael and Ron have mentioned, as we all acknowledge, is that by this moment, by 1936, although this exhibition featured an extraordinary amount of both historic and modern art, including old masters and including Impressionist work, what critics singled out as far as Texas work and talked about being the start of something new and something very important was the work of the younger generation, like William Lester, the artist who became known in particular as the Dallas Nine. So this does provide a convenient end of the story. Now let's back up just a little bit and let's revisit the idea of Impressionism. Michael gave us a really good definition, and this picture basically exemplifies it. This is the urtext of French Impressionism. Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise from 1872, then as now conserved at the Musée Marmottan Paris, where you go when you want both a wonderful immersive experience in Monet and also just an extraordinary trip to see one of the lesser traveled museums in the French capital. But this picture basically shows you that radicality of vision that becomes so important for adherence to Impressionism. The broken brush strokes, the interest in actually having the surface of the picture be the surface, the flatness, the attempt to replicate the rather radical properties of vision, and the absolute rejection in many respects of that Albertian idea that a painting is a window into another world that artists had been dealing with since the Renaissance, in particular in Western Europe, where there's the idea that everything sort of resolves to a single vanishing point and you could walk into the landscape. And it is a very pretty, coherent picture, and artists like Monet and his contemporaries blew that apart. And through the group exhibitions that they participated in, as we know, of course, ran afoul of the official French art world. And this is what excited younger artists. I show you an example because I'm shamelessly plugging the San Antonio Museum of Art of our only Impressionist picture, this wonderful little Armand Guillemot, which we've just reframed, hanging on the 4th floor of the East Tower, of the suspension bridge given to us by the same gentleman, Gib Denman, who also gave us one of our best Onderdonks, which you'll see a little bit later in the course of this presentation. And you can see here, of course, an interest in leisure, landscape, commerce, work, as well as radical ideas about color and handling, which, although tiny, this picture completely exemplifies. Guillemot, by the way, is one of the lesser known of the artists who exhibited in that first generation of Impressionists, but he's quite fascinating because he worked for the railroad. Painting was his sort of Sunday job, an evening job, and then he won a lottery, which allowed him to quit his day job and paint. So there is hope out there for Powerball winners everywhere. It wasn't long before Americans got excited about what was coming out of France, and our exhibition definitely looks at that moment of transmission. And the moment of transmission happens thanks to a generation of younger American artists who go to France to drink at the source, as it were, such as Lilla Cabot Perry, who is from New England, and with the support of her husband, goes to France, moves to Giverny, where she becomes friends with Monet in 1889 and spends the next 10 years painting in Giverny with Monet. She buys property there. That house is owned now by the Terra Foundation of American Art out of Chicago, and was for a while a museum itself. And this is a work in our collection that you can see on view, and that will also be featured, as it should be, on the checklist and then traveling for the show, of Perry on site in Giverny painting an old farm. And then, of course, thanks to the efforts of artists like Perry and Mary Cassatt, who was one of the initial practitioners of Impressionism and convinced American friends to buy this work, Impressionism starts to move into the US, and is articulated in this country through several very important exhibitions, such as 1893, the Exposition in Chicago, and other projects like that. You never can underestimate the role of exhibitions like the one that we have today in inspiring visitors, inspiring other artists in particular. If you're an art teacher, tell your students to come see this project, and then also in disseminating artwork at large. Exhibitions are a mechanism. So let's think about, within this state then, some of the artists, some of whom we've already looked at, and we've already seen this image at lunch, for example, this wonderful portrait of Emma Richardson Cherry, who were so instrumental in their own work and in their activities in making Impressionism take root, as it were, in Texas. So Emma Richardson Cherry, whom we see here, I showed you, of course, that marvelous painting in the Pines. Cherry, we claim, as a Texan. She was in Houston for nearly 60 years, but she was raised in Illinois and then went to the Art Students League in New York, where she studied with William Merritt Chase, whom you see here. Chase is one of the major conduits for Impressionism in this country, and he'll be featured as such in the exhibition. This is our great pastel of his wife and one of his children. I'm going to see Grandma, going to see Mrs. Virginia Gerson Chase's mother. But Chase, of course, was a protean figure, not just landscape, but also portraiture, still life. So we kind of put artists in boxes at times, and I think we need to be aware that, oftentimes they are much more complex and slippery than we sometimes treat them as. Chase is one of those artists, so is Arpa, and so is Emma Richardson Cherry. But so this is one of the influences that Cherry absorbed, and while she was in New York, we know for a fact, and we know this thanks to the extraordinary detective work that Randy Tibbetts has done in his work on Emma Richardson Cherry, that she saw this exhibition, the Pedestal Fund exhibition in 1883, to fund the base of the gift of the new Statue of Liberty. And in that exhibition, she saw a number of works by Impressionist artists. She saw these two works, for example, by Edouard Manet, who, even though he is one of those slippery artists who often doesn't fit the traditional Impressionist rubric, think of him, remember, he is the painter of Olympia, and at the top right, this woman now in the Met, that is Victorine Meurent, the model and artist who was the subject of Olympia. These two pictures were shown there because they were in an early American collection, Irwin Davis's collection. He was one of those friends of Mary Cassatt who bought contemporary work at her urging and brought it home. And also this work was something that Emma Richardson Cherry saw at the Pedestal Fund exhibition. A painting of ballerinas, but not a pastel, but an oil painting on canvas by Edgar Degas, today at Hillstead. And this is kind of, a lot of us, when we think in the general public about it, French Impressionism, this is the kind of thing we focus on. Not necessarily Manet, but Degas with the ballerinas, and again, the sort of spatial experiments that he created. Cherry went on for further study in 1889 in Paris. She landed first at the Académie Julian. This is probably the best known of one of her several teachers, Jules Lefebvre. I bring this in partly just because it's a great example of Lefebvre's work, and also just to say that nothing is particularly pure, because this is not, of course, he's not an Impressionist. This is an eminently traditional salon painter with that slightly unsettling mixture, I would argue, of super hyper realism. Look at the glistening paving stones of Lady Godiva as she goes through her ride, and the absolutely typical sort of Breton architecture that she rides through. And then that kind of unsettling little bit of eroticism that comes in with the realism. And that mixture is, the best example of that mixture is Bouguereau, who is the most successful contemporary artist of the 1890s because of that mixture. And somebody, P.S., the Impressionists absolutely hated. But Cherry made her way to Giverny and to Normandy. And this marvelous little picture, it's small, clearly was painted on site, and shows you that she did not take on the Lady Godiva mode. She actually took on something rather radical and modern. The flatness, the attention to local color, the emotional colors. the brush strokes. This is a marvelous work that shows that she was really responding to what she saw. And I should point out something very interesting, which is true of Cherry and also true of her great friend and colleague Dawson Watson. They did not, unlike Lilla Cabot Perry, become friends with Monet. By that point in time, he wasn't mixing with the Americans who were there. He actually, as Michael has brought out too, that, kind of regarded them as a plague on his house, who were there getting in the way of the business of painting the Japanese bridge. So they're in the wake of Monet, and they're certainly seeing the countryside through his work, but there's not the direct conversation and transmission that there is in the case of Lilla Cabot Perry, for example. Richardson comes home first to Denver, then to Texas. Her brother famously calls Houston a mud hole, and she didn't treat Houston like a mud hole. It's hard to imagine Houston as it is today, particularly the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, without the influence of Emma Richardson Cherry, who went on to be one of the founders of the museum and an extraordinary teacher, and her style continued to evolve. So I just show you this later example on view in our collection. This is our only Emma Richardson Cherry. We hang it in the Texas Gallery, but it's not a Texas scene. It is, of course, a scene of the Cheyenne Canyon, but it shows that she continued to respond to the world that she saw around her. But she also moved into fascinating other veins of modernism, such as Cubism, Surrealism, and again, this is somebody who never, ever stops looking and never stops learning. Michael mentioned Lucian Abrams, and I saw that show when it was at Albany, and it was a terrific show. He is a somewhat unsung contributor, I think, to the history of art in Texas. He's also one of those artists who was extraordinarily celebrated in his day, and I hope that the work that Michael has done and other scholars have done make us take a new look at some of these artists who were the most important contemporary artists of their day. They showed at the National Academy of Design, they showed at the Corcoran, they showed at the Art Institute of Chicago, and our appreciation of a lot of these artists has been skewed by the narrative about the Armory Show, now 106 years old, where we're told that irrevocably and inexorably modern abstraction came in, modernism came in, a particular sort of modernism, and everything else became retarded tear. And that's actually not really the case. And I think Abrams complicates this. He spent 21 years traveling and studying in Europe, and he, like Emma Richardson Cherry, responds to, like Arpa, responds to what he sees, and his style is varied and wonderful. This is just a beautiful example of his work in San Antonio today at the McNay, showing Luncheon in Provence. He fell in love in particular with the work of Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and in fact, a lot of the Renoirs at the McNay are due to the gift by Abrams to the McNay. Remember, the McNay is the first modern art museum in Texas, and Lucian Abrams is one of the people who, it's not just Mrs. McNay, it is also her friends and colleagues who help bring in various strands of modernism into that story. And this is a particularly good one that you can see what he's getting from Renoir, the interest in leisure in the middle of an otherwise kind of urban moment, the interest, again, in playing with space, the wonderful dappling effect of light. And then this is a slightly different Abrams today at the Dallas Museum of Art that was shown at the State Fair of Texas in the same exhibition that Colin Campbell Cooper painting I showed you of the Flatiron Building was exhibited, and also, like that painting, bought off the easel by the Dallas Art Association as red hot contemporary art. So his works, both through his efforts as a curator, if you will, and also as an exhibiting artist, also helped to bring Impressionism into Texas. This is a marvelous bust of Edward G. Eisenlohr by Allie Tennant, who we just heard about from Becky Duvall-Reese. And this is, when you think of Tennant, you think of these marvelously archaic sort of torsos and figures. And I love seeing this more figurative work. It's always interesting to see how one artist interprets and recognizes another artist, these sort of friend portraits. And this is a beautiful example of that. Eisenlohr is one of those extraordinary figures who is very influential as a teacher, as a practitioner. He also is one of those slippery artists who resists characterization. Like Armand Guillemin, he is a late bloomer. He doesn't become a full-time artist until age 35. He worked as a banker. Then he studied with Frank Ray and Julian Onderdonk, and then took the leap and goes to Woodstock, New York, where he studies with Birch Harrison. Here, this is a characteristic example of Birch Harrison, actually a Canadian seen by this artist who's closely associated with, he's a teacher at the Woodstock, New York Art Colony, which is one of the American art colonies set up in emulation of Giverny. If you want to see great Birch Harrison, you will look for him in vain because unfortunately he hasn't made it out of the storerooms yet. The taste is, but the tide will shift. And when the tide shifts, PAPA, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, is going to be the one who shifts it because they have some of the most extraordinary examples of his art, like this particular one. And furthermore, Eisenlohr went abroad and he brings in a particularly interesting strain from Germany. So this is his teacher at Karlsruhe, one of the great art schools in Germany of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Gustaf Schönleber. This is an example that sold several years ago by Schönleber under the bridge Strasbourg. Schönleber in particular advocated painting what you see. And this is something that I think resonated particularly firmly with Eisenlohr because, as we know, we always quote his famous saying, which is such a wonderful saying about painting what you see. And the quote, of course, is, if you can't find a landscape worth painting within 10 miles of where you are, no matter where you are, then you shouldn't be a painter. This work from the DMA's collection, which was a gift from Nona and Richard Barrett in 2007, is June Fields. This will be, we just got the official word from the DMA, thank you, Sue Canterbury, that this is one of the works from the DMA that will actually be on the presentation here in San Antonio and the tour nationally. It is a scene of haystacks. You might be excused in thinking that this could be, again, Giverny or somewhere like this, but I think that flatness should be a dead giveaway that you're on the plains of North Texas. It's a marvelous little work by Eisenlohr. But this is where he gets a little slipperier. Why am I not? There we go. So look at this, also from the DMA's collection. Corral at Fredericksburg, the Nimitz Hotel. There are characteristics that we think of as impressionistic here. And of course, it's about being in nature, being painted, paint what you see, being in nature. There's great, look at the foreground. There's great examples of primary colors and just this broken stroke. But those contour lines are rather fascinating, those heavy contour lines and the emotive quality of this work that is not quite local color. And this is where I'm actually very excited about your project, Michael, about the Texas Fauves, because with something like this, we're getting into something different. I don't know whether it is Fauvism, whether it's expressionism, but it reminds us, I think, of the fact that modernism is, or rather we should say modernisms, are multiple and messy, and that many of these artists, because they were so visually oriented and they traveled and they looked and they were curious, is that the story that I am sort of ruthlessly simplifying and summarizing about Impressionism is not the only story, and that it exists concurrently with other types of modernism in this state. And that's the best part about, you know, continuing curatorial work, is because, you know, eventually these stories get to be told. We've seen this marvelous image of Dawson Watson before. And here's where we start getting into the international guys, because as we know, Dawson Watson, born and first trained in England, then in France, also had a fairly academic background thanks to his father, thanks to his first instructor in London, and thanks to his training in France, and then becomes radicalized by his experience at Giverny, which is partly due to his close friendship with Emma Richardson Cherry, whom he meets, and of course, as we know, he falls head over heels in love with her best friend, who is also an artist. They marry within, 4 or 5 months, something ridiculously romantic like that. And you see this picture, which sold last fall, of Harvest Time, painted in Giverny. You can see that Dawson Watts is responding to, by this time, what Cherry is responding to, and other young artists are responding to. Notice how the horizon, the foreground starts to be completely flat, the brushstrokes start to become focused, we crop out a lot of the hills in the background. But I also want to point out again, to emphasize the messiness of this, that the fascination with these figures harvesting is not particularly impressionistic. It actually is something that is really more aligned with academic painting. So think, for example, of Daniel Ridgway Knight, the American artist who is very slick and polished at this time. Think, for example, of the young Paul Gauguin, who is doing exactly just this at the same time before he becomes enamored of sort of fauvistic color and then makes the move from northern France to the South Seas. So there are multiple influences coming to bear here. Dawson Watts, thanks to his wife, is one of the people, I would argue, who is very instrumental in the spread of Impressionism to this country, because they come back to the US, they settle in Woodstock, where he teaches, so he is able to bring in the influence of contemporary art that he has either made or seen in France. He also works in Hartford, so he is next to, not far away from the beating heart of one of the great American Impressionist colonies that Michael mentioned, Florence Griswold's colony in Old Lyme, Connecticut. And then through his peregrinations to St. Louis, he helps bring contemporary style into the Midwest. And through his friendships with San Antonio artists, in particular Rolla Taylor, he winds up starting to visit and expose in San Antonio. And it is, of course, the San Antonio competitive exhibitions that change everything for him and allow us to claim him. This is a terrific picture in the Art League and Museum from 1927, showing the subject matter that Dawson Watts discovers and embraces for virtually the last 12 years of his career, which coincide with his residency in his permanent residency in San Antonio. That is, of course, the cactus. And I would like to, I talked about in a different project years and years ago, I talked about Julian's water lilies being the bluebonnet. Well, this is Dawson, the cactus is Dawson Watson's water lilies. And as he famously wrote about it in another oft-repeated quote, "I worship it. Kiss my hand to its tiniest bloom. I've painted it inside out, upside down, and crosswise." And there is a Dawson Watts, of course, outside that you can take a look at on the easel, and you will see that he does just that. One of the other great international artists thrown into the mix is the influence of Jose Arpa, whom you see here in a characteristic self-portrait. This is in our collection. And I want to say that he is also, we label him as impressionist, but he brings in so many other influences. He brings in 19th century Spanish landscape painting, because of course he is a Spaniard from Sevilla, and landscape painting in Spain. By the when Arpa was born in 1860, by the time Arpa is really painting in the 1880s, landscape has only been approved by the Academy of San Fernando for 30 years. Thanks to the efforts of Carlos de Hayes, the half Belgian, half Spanish first professor of landscape painting at San Fernando, who makes it okay for artists to concentrate on this. Arpa also, because like Dawson Watson, his travels that take him to Italy, that brings in other influences. When you look at Arpa's work, and particularly those marvelous portraits like the ones we've seen earlier today, it's hard not to see the Ottocento artists of 19th century Italy. Moving forward, he of course goes to Mexico. This is a painting made in Mexico that you could see in San Antonio before the revolution, which is what brings him with his patrons to San Antonio. And then, of course, there is the classic kind of only in Texas landscape, such as Barrett's sloping hills, that could only be made here. Now, what I want to point out is that Arpa is fairly interesting because his paintings are as much about absences as presences. Those diagonals with which he is obsessed, these are paintings that both attract and repel. You know, you can't walk into them in the way you can walk into the works of Frank Ray or Julian Onderdonk. You'll hear much more about Frank Ray tomorrow, but I just show you some of his academic formation. It's amazing to think of Frank Ray hitting upon his style when you look at his teachers like Constant, this lurid salon Orientalism, or this kind of simpering version of Impressionism by Henri Doucet. But what I think leavens that is the influence of the Hague School, somebody like Anton Mauve. And so, of course, when he comes back to Texas, in works like this marvelously rare Ray painting of Driving the Herd, you can see that he is evening it out and really responding to the landscape, which the famous sketching trips beginning in the 1890 to West Texas, and this is just a characteristic example that I bring in, really reveal. If you want to see the best rays, you will go to Canyon, to the Panhandle Plains Museum. This is a representative example there. And as been mentioned, it is not just through works like this, but through his teaching that Ray really becomes so influential. So here is L.O. Griffith, while a student, painting a scene from Ray's house. Now, let's whiz through Julian really quickly, because we've spent a lot of time with him. Certainly I know I have. Remember, his first teacher was his father, Robert. You'll see this work in the show, who sends him to New York, where he ultimately studies in 1901, the next to last year of the Shinnecock Summer School with William Merritt Chase, in this picture in Marie Half's collection here in San Antonio. And then when he comes back to Texas, first peripatetically and then finally permanently after 1912, he is looking at Texas, but he's definitely thinking about what he's learned from Chase, such as you see here. And then, of course, he hits upon the bluebonnets in the mid-teens. He doesn't invent this, but he certainly does popularize it. This is one of our iconic bluebonnet paintings by him. And then so here are individual artists, and as Michael pointed out, the crucible of this really, I think, is the Davis Prize, as we now call it. Edgar Davis, the multiple fortune, he made it, he lost it, he made it, he lost it, he made it again. The wildcatter who put Luling on the map thanks to finally discovering oil, and gives it back to the world because he claims to have been inspired by wildflowers while he was looking for oil. For 3 years sustained an art prize, which at that time was the biggest art prize in the US. For 3 years, he gave away a total of $53,000. I did the math, that would be $873,000 in 2019 money. So rather extraordinary. It shifted everything. It shifted critical attention to Texas. It physically shifted artists such as Dawson Watson to permanently reside here. It brought judges to San Antonio who were minor impressionists like Charles Courtney Curran, and it rewarded the creation of pictures like this. So let's just run through the prize winners really quickly. Year one, and then in 28 and 29, categories began to expand. So there are actually 4 divisions where you can win in. We bring in ranch life as well, cotton fields, I'd love to know where this is today, and I'd love to have a good image of it. This is probably the best picture I think Arpa ever made. Extraordinary. So here's the thing, summing up really quickly because I'm running out of time. Thinking about all of this, we have to think about where Texas Impressionism, how it intersects with and what it is and isn't like everything else, because it is truly inflected by both national and international influences. What it doesn't seem to have is what we see in some examples of classic Northeastern American Impressionism, such as you see here by Julian Alden Ware in New England, or Robert Spencer in Pennsylvania. This is not a painting of modern life in the sense that it's not a painting of urban modern life. There is not the same interest or critique of industry or of the way people live. What it does have is a curious nostalgia at times. And I show you William Went, the California painter, who is best known for some of his images of mountains, but also images like this of bygone days showing one of the California missions, where there starts to creep in a nostalgia for the colonial past of the area. And Dawson Watson certainly shares that with his many, many, many images at the end of his career of the Spanish governor's palace. As Michael said, things like the Davis Prize spawn a legacy, and that legacy was fairly safe. It was a popularized, monetized type of art making by the 30s that persists to this day. And Salinas, the jury can go back and forth over whether we, when we like him, when we don't. When he's good, he's great. This is a beautiful work by him. But I want to point out that the reason why Salinas was so prolific this way, you wouldn't have this type of art without something like the San Antonio competitive exhibitions that made it possible. So that by the late 20s and certainly into the 30s and beyond, what started out as radical in Europe had, of course, become not radical here in the United States, and particularly in Texas, where whenever you see agriculture, it's celebrated, it's not questioned. Cotton picking is just sort of validated as part of the economic driver of Texas's economy, but you don't question whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing in the way that other artists question the idea of modern life and modern activity. The questioning comes from artists, a younger generation of artists, which are even being seen as such in the 1936 centennial. So I just bring in this as to flatter Katie Edwards, because this is in her book, and we were lucky enough to buy this a few years ago at auction. The younger generation, like Everett Spruce, William Lester, Tony Lascelles, who needs to be dealt with in great detail, and other artists who interrogate stylistically what they see and interrogate the world around them. And those stories are yet to be told, and I know there are people in this audience who will keep telling them. Thank you for letting me go over a little bit. I'm happy to take some questions. Yes.
Could you speak to pastel as a medium in terms of impressionism, especially in Texas, because it's almost exclusively
Yes, of course, and that's a wonderful question. So the question is about pastel as a medium, and it is possibly, I would say, it is the quintessential impressionist medium because it is portable. It is, so if you've used a crepa in school or somewhere, you've used an oil pastel, because that's what it is, the oil crayon. So it's portable. You are able to then work outside en plein air, as it were, and paint what's in front of you. And so it lends itself, if you're intellectually like Frank Ray, and I would say that Frank Ray is probably the most intellectual American Impressionist, followed by Julian Onderdonk. And Julian, who knows, he died too young, but Mr. Ray certainly, I think, had the most intellectual foundation of it. The others slip here and there. But if you are going to, if you are following that idea of truth in nature and working outside, and that was certainly something that William Merritt Chase advocated, and he advocated for his students like Julian, the pastel is the way to do it. Now the problem is that because often you're using pastel on paper, you inadvertently write yourself out of art history, because museums, and we are no different, we are whores for canvas and panels and sculpture, and we are terrified of what we call light sensitive works, which pastels usually are because they're done on paper. So in the interests of stewardship, we limit our exposure of them, as we mean well, but unfortunately then we often leave out the contributions that things like pastels play in both the development of an artist's style and in the spread of a particular artistic movement. It's a great question. All right, anybody else?
William and I can have a conversation.
I'd say, yeah, go ahead.
A little bit off point from your presentation.
Yeah.
Like I was wondering, you don't see Warren Mosley represented in this show. We think he's a great.
Judge Chitty, I think he's a great painter too. I didn't include him in this partly just because I was showing you largely what I'm focusing on for our very limited checklist in our American Impressionism show, because we only had so many slots that we were able to fill for our checklist. Now, I'm hoping when the show is in San Antonio next summer that I can sort of complimentary, like in my Texas gallery, reinstall that and show more to tell a fuller story. But I agree with you. He's somebody we should look at and should know more about. I just did not choose to do him this way, but it isn't to imply that he isn't an important artist, because he is. As also Ella McQuinney is. There are so many people that I was making some pretty hard choices and focusing for good or for ill on some of the biggies.
Okay, yes, this does work. Great. Great talk, William. Thank you so much for speaking.
Thanks.
You mentioned that cotton was a safe topic by the time you get to the 30s. Given
With one exception.
Well, yeah, well, that's where I was going with that. The Arpa. Can you tell us what makes his painting of cotton radical?
Well, that wasn't the exception I was thinking of. I was actually thinking of a different painting that has not been much seen, but was commented on a lot during, I think it was it 1928, the second competition, that was sort of held up as a problem picture because it was looked at as sort of degrading, and it was an image of African Americans in a cotton field, and it was seen as undignified, not because anyone particularly cared at that moment, sadly, about whether the African Americans cared about their own representation, but because it wasn't a celebratory, kind of safe image of just people happily working. And that was really my point, is that the images that won prizes more or less, sort of uncritically represent the fact that here's this industry, here are people working. I think Arpa's picture is marvelous because I think, like Jean-Francois Millet's The Gleaners, it actually brings dignity to people whose existences are among actually the most difficult and the hardest in terms of the type of work that they do. But I can tell you that's not part, when you go back and you read the critical dialogue that's published at the time about the works of art, it's that kind of examination is not part of it. It's kind of like and I don't think that was part of thinking of trying to interpret Mr. Davis. I think it's more of a, ranch life and cotton farming and the landscape. It's much more of a celebratory look at what we've got. Look at what we, look at who we are, rather than too deep of a dive, like someone like Julian Alden Ware, for example, does into, let's try to aestheticize this thing, mills that are, changing the demographic composition of New England and actually radically changing life. I think it could. I don't think I'm qualified to, to come down on either side of that argument, but I think it's historically inflected by that too. And I'd be curious, to think more about that. Absolutely.
Just for clarification, when the Davis competition was expanded, cotton field, not cotton field.
True. Right. Good clarification.
And the other part is what Ken's asked about, is there was a slogan in Texas in the 20s that said Mexican cotton. Beware of that.
Yeah. So they, so in that sense, there's an index of not even unconscious, but rather deliberate blasé racism, which we find rightfully unpleasant and reprehensible in the 21st century. But I also want to say, because the discussion in one of the earlier topics about Confederate monuments, particularly even in San Antonio and Mr. Capini and things like that, all of these things, when we look at historical material, I think it's good that we raise these questions. I think we ought to raise these questions. We have to raise these questions. But one of the things I want us all to remember, please, as a curator, I say this, let's not punish the art for being made in the time in which it was made. Let's figure out ways to interpret it. Let's do the right thing by it. And let's be aware that art changes over time and our responses change over time. But I would like to, I would, in my own small way, want to shift the needle away from saying something is a good or bad work of art because we don't like the moment in which it was made. I think that's unfair to the original historical context, even though we do need to interrogate that original historical context. Okay, I have gone on way too long and you've been a great audience, but thank you so much, and thank you, Michael.